All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Modern Biopharma Podcast. Today on our episode, we have Ravi Samavedam. He is the president and COO at Azzur Cleanrooms on Demand. Ravi, welcome. How are you doing today?
Good, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, hey, we're going to, before we get into this and talk about clean rooms, which is something that you know a lot about, what I'd like for you to do is, if you could, is just share a little bit about who you are and just sort of your background in the industry.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been in the industry for about 21 years. I'm a biochemical engineer by education. First half of my career was with mostly with big pharma companies such as Baxter, Amgen, and Shire. And then the second half has been mostly doing consulting and recently working with clean rooms and working with startup companies more so than established traditional companies.
Excellent. So is there a reason that you've in the consulting world, you're more on the startup companies? Is it just because that's what the consulting world is doing, or because big pharma, we have a lot of it up here in New England, right? That's
right. So when I started consulting with Azzur, I joined in 2012. It was still, traditional biopharma, large molecule, big companies with big facilities. But then right around 2014, 2015, we saw a shift, especially in the Cambridge market, where there'll be all of these startups coming up with these novel technologies that require a completely different setup, much smaller, much modular. So that's how we kind of pivoted to serving mostly startups, primarily because of the geography that we are in, right? The Cambridge market being such a huge startup activity zone.
Yeah, I saw something the other day. I think 2020 was a record. It was a record year, I believe, for investment in Massachusetts in the biotech space, and we hit that same number, I think, by like March in right. 2021. It's insane how much money is being invested right now in the Boston market. So it's pretty exciting to be around. So all right, so that's your background. So just something personal. One of the things I like to ask everybody, I got to come up with some other new questions for this, but could you tell us about maybe a book you're reading right now, just so people can get a feel for who Ravi is?
Yeah, there's a book by Yuval Noah Harari called *Sapiens*, which I just started reading. It's pretty cool. It's a unique way of looking at evolution of humanity in general by bringing in all facets of human life, right? History, geography, politics. It's pretty cool to see how so many things that are like epiphany moments when I read that book.
Have you made it very far? I mean, it's a kind of a big book, right?
Yeah. I'd say like the first third of the book still.
That's always the best part of a book anyway, right? The first. Yeah. I think I read that like 3 years ago, or let's be, I listened to it because reading is falling asleep time. So I listened to it. It's a great book. I enjoyed it a lot. Awesome. All right. So we're going to talk about clean rooms today, because that's what you guys do. So if we could, our listeners to this show, they span like a really great range. I would say we have a lot of younger people in the industry that are listening. So in their 20s, young 30s, that kind of age. And then, and then it goes up. But I think that's probably our biggest group of people that listen, especially to the podcast portion, rather than say the video. So they might have their first job working in a company in biotech, and they, just like anybody else, they get a job doing a thing. They don't have exposure to the whole facility. They haven't been at multiple companies. So when they listen to something like this, they go, oh yeah, clean. What? I mean, I hear about it. I know it's over there down the hall. I never go in there. Right. So if you could just give us just an overview what clean rooms are, and we'll just sort of talk about that a little bit, like what they're for, what they do, why they do. Could you just talk about that real quick?
Absolutely. So for any product that's going into human beings, as you probably know, clinical trials are required. So that's really the first time when GMP regulations or good manufacturing practices come into play. So for a lot of these startups that are transitioning from that preclinical to clinical manufacturing for the first time, there's a lot more control that's needed. Before clinical manufacturing, the level of regulatory oversight is pretty minimal. So when they do that transition, all of a sudden they need these areas that are controlled to a very high level of cleanliness, both in terms of the air quality, but also in terms of controls of particulate generation, microbial contamination, which can happen through people, through equipment, through the materials that are used. So in summary, the clean room is a space that is controlled to a very strict level of cleanliness that allows for products to be manufactured with high level of confidence that they'll not be contaminated by foreign substances. That's kind of in a nutshell what a clean room is.
Mm-hmm. And so when I think of clean rooms, I always think air. Is there more to it than air?
That's correct. Yeah. So air obviously is one a place where your clean room can get contaminated. But remember, personnel, the gowning materials that they wear, the equipment that's brought in, the raw materials that are used in the manufacturing process, or things that are inherent to the process itself, the actions that people take may generate both particles, just regular particles, but also microbial particles, which is a much higher concern for biotech processes. So yeah, it's really a variety of things that need to be controlled to get to the level where you have adequate confidence to work in that space.
Okay. Okay. So like one of the big things people are going to hear when they hear clean rooms is different classifications of clean rooms, right? So, and I know that there's two different ways that we see it. And I know one's more, say, North America based versus European based, I believe. And they seem to end up being interchangeable. And people that are really familiar with those spaces, it's their language really great. But could you talk to the different classifications and what they mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are several ways of classifying, or several regions that classify clean rooms differently. So you'll hear the word class, like class 100, class 1000, and so on. But there's also grades, which the EU utilizes. So yeah, there's different ways of doing it, but it's all based on the level of particles in a given volume in that clean room, right? So if it's ISO 7 space, it has a certain level of particles versus ISO 5, which will have lower number of particles as a minimum requirement. So in other words, if you look at the ISO table, the lower the ISO number, the cleaner the room is, right? But it's all based on monitoring of particulates within that room. So that's the basis really is. And the way you control the air is through these HEPA filtration systems that sit either on top of the clean room itself or is being filtered before it comes into the room somehow.
Okay, so you have your ISO grades, which means the lower the number. So is it 1 through 10, or what's the levels?
One would probably be the cleanest, and biotech, the highest classification of biotech that I have seen anyways is ISO 5, which is also called class 100. So that's where sterile products can be manufactured with high level of confidence that the air itself and the environment itself is not going to contaminate the product.
Okay, so 1 to 5, and then on the other scale, you have 100,000, 10,000. So that's the number of explain what that is. Is it, doesn't it go the opposite direction?
For classes, right? So if you look, we talked about ISO 7. So the lower the ISO number, the cleaner the room. But when you're talking about class, like class 100, class 1000, that's the opposite. So the higher, what that means is a class 100 room is cleaner than a class 1000 room. For biotech manufacturing, the span really is ISO 5 or class 100 to 100,000, right? So typically you don't see anything beyond that. So what you want to do is you want to have a step down approach to how you control your spaces, right? So you want to go from a controlled but non-classified space, and then to what we call an ISO 8 area or class 100,000, and then ISO 7, which is class 10,000, and then lower grades if you need that for a specific operation.
Okay.
Now again, not all biotech processes need to be manufactured at one level or the other. It really depends on the intended use of that space. So for example, if you're making sterile products, there is a regulatory requirement that you make it in a space that's equivalent to ISO 5 or class 100. Whereas if you're making a drug substance, which is more of an intermediate, it's not the final product that the patient sees, you typically don't have a sterility requirement. You have some level of microbial particles that you accept within even the product. So in those cases, typically you look at an ISO 7 environment or class 10,000 environment more so than an ISO 5 or class 100 environment.
Okay. All right. Awesome. All right. So when you talked about this a few minutes ago, you talked about clean rooms in respect to when a product's being studied, right? And then they get into the GMP. Oh, now we need to start manufacturing, and it could be, preclinical manufacture. There's all different levels to maybe what your former employers were like, where it's monster facilities. So could you talk about where the clean rooms actually are in a facility? If you visit a big facility up here in New England, there's a few giant ones. There's tons of space associated with manufacturing that's just big hallways and warehouses, and it's not necessarily a controlled space from a clean room perspective. So where are the areas that you're going to see clean rooms most prevalently? And actually, I'm actually interested in where maybe clean rooms are utilized that we wouldn't think of. That I think that would be interesting as well.
Yeah. So in general, right, clean rooms will be required in places where you need some level of microbial and general particulate controls, right? So, majority of the biotech processes inherently have the risk of microbial contamination. So in general, very generally speaking, if it's in the biopharma, biotech industry, typically at some point in your process, you will need some level of clean rooms that are required. Clean rooms have been traditionally used by semiconductor industries, and that's more so not necessarily from a microbial standpoint, but just gross particle standpoint. Because as you can imagine, wafer chip manufacturing can be very prone to, particles, foreign particles. So that industry has been using clean rooms for a while as well. Med device industries use clean rooms as well, although ISO 8 is more common because a lot of these med devices are terminally sterilized after the manufacturing happens.
Right.
Certain diagnostic companies use clean rooms, especially those that are making diagnostics that are susceptible to microbial contamination. And some of these raw material providers also use clean rooms, whether it be raw material powders going into the batches or some process intermediates such as buffers. Because remember, it's not just the activities happening on site that can create these particles, right? It's also the supply chain. Where is your raw material coming from? What level of control is there? So all of those things also need to be controlled to make sure that even though your facility is designed properly, the inputs coming into the facility are controlled.
So once whatever that facility is doing has their product, I mean, it could be a vial, or it could be, a giant bag of, drug substance, right? Once it's in that form, is it still, stored in clean rooms, or is it transported in clean rooms? I'm curious if there's any element of that happens.
No, not typically. So once the batch is made, right, depending on the storage conditions, you store it in either a refrigerator, freezer, or just ambient racks. But the key there is if it's final product or any sort of intermediate that's, again, susceptible to microbial contamination, you want to have the appropriate containers kind of at least reviewed and verified to be suitable for intended use. So in that example, the bag that you're using, you want to make sure that that bag has some level of pre-sterilization that's been performed, if that's critical to your process step, right? So,
right.
So in that, if you take that example, you extend it to the entire process, you want to do some level of risk assessment where you're looking at all the inputs into your process and figuring out how to control it to make sure the clean room itself, the physical infrastructure is one thing, but also the actual operations that happen inside the facility, inside the clean room, can yield in a product that's of unacceptable product quality, right? So that's where you need all those ancillary controls as well.
Yeah, and we talk about like a controlled space versus a clean. That's not the same thing. There's
Correct.
a lot of controlled spaces that have nothing to do with being clean rooms. So you need to maintain certain temperature, like you say, put it in a refrigerator, or, just this can be stored at ambient temperature, but you can't let it, can't leave the garage door open all day on a hot day and let the hot air in, right? So, okay, awesome. So one of the things I've seen in the industry quite a bit, I've seen a number of presentations on this, and I'm in the utility space personally, so I don't generally deal with this. There's a guy from CRB that's done a number of presentations on this, Mark Pelletier, and it's the use of closed processes. So this is becoming more and more common, and the idea being that the kind of the exposure of the product or the drug substance or the final product is contained inside of a space that is its own, clean room, if you will, right? So that it doesn't ever touch. And there's sort of a thinking like you could do this in your backyard, if you had the utilities hooked up to it, right? Because nothing can get in. working through isolators or whatever. There's different ways of doing this. So how does that impact the world of, clean rooms? Because, you guys are helping customers with clean rooms in their space. So do you, I don't know, work with the companies that make this equipment to right size it and fit that? How much are you working with the customer to do this the right way? I'm sure there's cost benefit analysis that go into which way is the right way. So could you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. So, over the last 20 years, there's been acceleration of use of disposable technologies, single-use technologies within the industry, especially over the, I'd say, last decade with the advent of cell and gene therapies, which are really small volume batches, right? You're not talking gigantic bioreactors, 10,000 liters, nothing like that, right? It's much smaller in volume. And the disposable technologies have grown so much that all of a sudden you don't need these stainless steel tanks and pipes that need to be cleaned and steamed, potential for leaks. You need drains in the clean rooms. So now what we have done is our clean rooms don't have any drains. There's no CIP, there's no SIP, there's no stainless steel. So inherently, changeover activities from one given batch to another is so much easier, right? You don't have to suddenly qualify the cleaning or sterilization processes. So by default, that has made the risk profile of any given process very, very low, right? All of a sudden, you have closed processes, full use of disposables. Where are the microbes going to enter into the process stream, right? So that has made, for companies like us, that is great, because now we can make a facility that can house multiple clean rooms with multiple products, not have to worry about the risk as much because every single process is closed, right? Back in the day, when you had stainless steel piping that potentially has a shared distribution system, a WFI system that's shared within multiple clean rooms, that single system can contaminate multiple systems. Whereas here with, fully disposable processes, with all these ancillary things that are not in play anymore, like drains and cleaning systems and WFI systems, all of a sudden going into the clinic is so much easier for companies in facilities like this, rather than your traditional stick-built stainless steel heavy processes. Yeah.
Okay. And ultimately, you end up having very specific spaces that you're talking about rather than larger spaces as a whole, right?
Exactly. And all of a sudden, right, your entire facility's risk profile is so much lower because, again, if your processes are primarily closed, the possibility of cross-contamination, spillage, all of that is reduced. So by default, your risk profile is reduced for the entire facility. So
okay.
That's also a great example of how technology is changing the way manufacturers are designing their process steps.
All right. So I just want to just angle a little bit towards what you guys are doing in the space rather than just generically. And I'm familiar with Azzur Group. It's been around for a while. I see them at trade shows, and I know some of the people that work there. Just got to go out to Denver for a meeting not that long ago and met up with some of your folks that live out there. But I've always known Azzur Group in relation to consulting. That's the space that I've seen them in. But this is a relatively new thing. Can you talk a little bit to the pivot that you guys have made towards doing clean rooms? Maybe what's different, what's unique? Because this is more of a, I guess I think of it more of as a product versus in the consulting space, right? So could you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. So the name Azzur Group was formed in 2010 as a merger between two companies. Back then, those two companies were primarily doing equipment and computer validation, not much else. And then I joined around 2012, and I was part of another company called Biospec, which merged with the Azzur Group in 2013. So back then, we were still primarily a consulting firm doing mostly equipment, computer validation, a little bit of process and cleaning validation, but that's pretty much it. But then over the years, we've added on other functions, right, such as labs. In 2012, we opened Azzur Labs, and then we started a training center not too long ago. We added IT services. And then right around, I'd say maybe 2015 and 2016, in the Cambridge area, we started getting requests from startup firms more so than traditional big pharma. And we started doing things like risk management, writing policies and SOPs from ground up, and helping companies get to the clinic on their own. Mm-hmm. And during that time, we realized how hard it is to really get to GMP from scratch, right? So in a couple of examples, we helped companies build clean rooms in a high rise in Cambridge, in a basement in Cambridge. And it took, 18 to 24 months to get a small project like that done. Of course, all the quality management system and all of that had to also be developed from scratch. And when we saw that, and we also saw as part of our consulting how hard it is to find a CMO slot, right? All the contract manufacturers out there that are good have a huge waiting list. And even after the waiting list, after you've reached the front of the line, there's a tech transfer process that takes a long time.
Mm.
When we saw this over and over again, and our clients basically struggling to get to clinic because of these kind of roadblocks of the traditional ways of getting into GMP, we said, what if we built some clean rooms and provided some ancillary services? Next time a client comes and asks us to design, build a clean room in Cambridge, we'll say, don't do that. Instead, come to our Waltham facility. We have a few clean rooms. So that idea started in 2017, and our first set of clients came to the Waltham site in 2018. So that's when we decided, this is a business of its own. And like you said, it's more of a product, right? It's almost like clean rooms as a service, right?
Mm-hmm.
GMP as a service almost. So in 2018, we realized we need to focus a lot more on this business. And we expanded from Waltham to, Burlington and San Diego. So we went from basically 2 small clean rooms to right now we have 37 clean rooms across the network. Our goal is to get to 180 clean rooms in the next 18 months. And we plan to go to all those hotbeds in the biopharma industry across the nation.
Okay. Wow. So you're setting up these spaces for companies to come in and use away from where their current space is.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, the traditional. Go ahead.
Can you just talk about how that plays out for a company?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So traditionally, right, there's really only two ways of going into GMP manufacturing. One, you internalize it. What does that mean? You build your own facility, hire all the personnel, you develop all the quality management systems, and run the whole thing yourself. That takes time, money, and effort. And honestly, for early phase clinical manufacturing, that's an overkill, right? What are you going to do while you're waiting for the clinical results? Your facilities still needs to be maintained. Your personnel still need to be on a payroll. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense going and building your own infrastructure that early on. What if your product fails in the clinic? What are you going to do with that facility and the infrastructure?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second option is really going to a third party and providing your intellectual property to the third party. And there's issues there as well. In addition to the wait times, there's a tech transfer process that could be, that has risk for failure. There's retraining of these third party operators that need to happen every time you want to make a change. So all of that results in basically time that's wasted while the molecule is waiting to get to the clinic. So that's where we come in and say, okay, bring in your process operators, and we can help you, create that GMP envelope for you if you need that. But then rely on us for all the ancillary services that you probably don't have the expertise in, whether it be raw materials management, asset management, equipment calibration, qualification, routine monitoring of equipment, supply chain, meaning, shipping out of samples and product, receiving raw materials on behalf of various clients. So when our clients have the ability to kind of, outsource those activities to us, they're still retaining their intellectual property, right? So for those who are concerned about giving away their secret sauce to a third party, they don't have to do that in our model. And in return, they're able to keep their science to themselves and quickly get to the clinic more so than the two traditional models.
Interesting. So there's a hybrid. It's a hybrid going on here, and it's not really a CMO, but it kind of there's a lot of similarities right there to the or a CDMO anyway.
Yes.
Space. So I mean, is the full infrastructure just in place for these things, or do you have to build in? If you got a new customer to come in and do this, are they having to bring in a bunch of their own stuff, or do you kind of have enough things sitting there that you just sort of take this piece of Lego over here and put it into place and you're good to go?
So the fastest way for clients to use our facilities is if they have some level of manufacturing expertise, or even if it's not GMP scale, even if it's like tox batches, as long as have that rudimentary amount of manufacturing expertise, we can help them get to that GMP stage. But they also typically bring in their process equipment. That's where it becomes a
Okay.
little bit of a challenge. If there are equipment lead times, then obviously that prohibits the client from moving in ASAP. Um, but we do provide some ancillary equipment, right? That are non-product contact, if you will, biosafety cabinets, pumps, scales, centrifuges, things of that nature.
Mm.
So with each client that comes in, there's an onboarding process where we sit down and figure out, okay, what equipment are they bringing, what materials are going to come on site, so that we are prepared to receive them and qualify them and so on. That process takes anywhere between 1 to 3 months. Compare that to a CMO or building your own facility. Obviously, there's a huge amount of time difference there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And this, this is happening on all levels of levels of this business, right? Even on the even earlier stage, I know there's facilities in Cambridge, multiple all over in the big biotech hubs where, if you're a scientist, you and your buddy have an idea, they have benches sitting there and you can rent them, right? For a lot cheaper than, opening up your own shop. And it's a great way to, get your feet under you and get moving without having to wait, or put up near as much capital on the front end of things. So it's pretty interesting concept. So, one of the questions I had was, it has been more in the past, like a traditional build out, right, of a place. So if you're trying to move forward, you are moving towards a CMO, or you are moving towards building your own facility. That's a more traditional approach. Do you just see this expanding more and more? Is there a certain kind of product or customer that this is really the right fit for versus, if it's Pfizer coming up with a new product, they probably aren't doing this as likely, right? Because they have facilities and they have infrastructure and they have arrangements with CMOs like ongoing. So do you have specific kinds, or even if you would, just like maybe certain parts of the market, right? So you talked about cell and gene therapy versus, some kind of oncology type product or more traditional pharma, OSD kind of space. Like, what are the things that you see make the most sense for this?
Yeah, so our facilities are really ideal for small batches. It's all early phase clinical manufacturing that we house. But it's really ideal for closed processes, heavy reliance on single-use technology. Like I mentioned, we do not have cleaning facilities, sterilization. We don't have drains. We don't even have W5 generation on site. And this is all by design, right? Because we want to cater to the cell and gene therapy market primarily. But it also works for similar processes that are closed, small volumes. Some things that will not work in our facilities are things that require stainless steel equipment, right? So the big bioreactors, so traditional, large molecule protein manufacturing is probably not amenable to our facilities. And we purposely built our facilities because that's where the action is these days, right? Cell and gene therapy is just booming.
Yeah.
It also works for, combination devices, traditional med device products, raw materials, diagnostics, things of that nature.
Okay. So one of the things that in our market that I think is we have a reputation a little bit in biopharm to just play it safe. We're always playing, the outside world may not feel that way, but any of us that operate in this space know that it's, patient safety is so ridiculously important. And so the amount of risks that you can take in this space is really, really low. Nobody wants to take any risks. But at the same time, we do have, things like we're talking about, closed processes that seem to be, pushing things a little bit. So do you feel like this is an offering that as a technology is pushing the market to be able to do things? Or do you feel like, I'm thinking chicken or egg here, is it pushing the market or is the market pushing the need for this? Do you have an opinion on that?
It's a little bit of both, actually. So, if the recent trend has been going modular as opposed to stick built, right? And there's a lot of examples where new companies have come up with panel-based clean rooms, right? Traditionally, like maybe 20 years ago, that was not the case. It was all stick built, big facilities, stainless steel infrastructure. So with the advent of these clean room manufacturers, now all of a sudden the industry has this novel, well, not super novel, but relatively new option to go into rather than stick-built clean rooms. That's one piece. The other piece that's happening is just by the nature, inherent nature of cell and gene therapy, cell therapy particularly, autologous that too, the volumes are so low, right? The volumes are tiny. Now the manufacturers or the vendors that are supporting the industry are forced to look at technologies that are amenable to those small batch manufacturing more so than big giant bioreactors, for example. So it's a little bit of both. The industry, the vendors, the suppliers are kind of forcing clients to think in a certain way in terms of how to make their batch, but also the cell and gene therapy technology itself is forcing the suppliers and vendors to come up with creative ways to make manufacturing happen.
All right, awesome. So I don't have any more big questions about clean rooms. It's one of those, I mean, it touches so many things and there's a million directions we could go, but I really want to just do a good introduction to this for people. One thing I would like though, is if you were to, reach out and touch that person through this podcast today that you feel like, hey, needs to hear this, what's that one thing, that you would say, hey, this is what we're doing and this is how we can really help you today, either make your, upcoming or new process run smoother, better? What's that one thing that you would tell that person?
Let's see, I guess the biggest challenge that we are seeing, or at least Azzur Cleanrooms on Demand is seeing based on the prospective clients that we speak to, is the time it takes to get to that GMP batch. And a lot of startup companies tend to underestimate the amount of work and the time involved in getting to GMP. So I guess my my advice to startup clients is do not underestimate the amount of time it takes, right? And if time is of a concern, come to clean rooms on demand, because again, the traditional approaches of either building your own facility or going to a CMO/CDMO, the time it takes and the level of flexibility that you lose is really what is the game changer when it comes to clean rooms on demand. You can go wait in line at a CMO or a CDMO for maybe 18 to 24 months, or take the same amount of time to build your infrastructure that may not be fully utilized, or you can do neither and come to our facility while you're planning on your future batches. So you can come in early phase to COD while you're design building your facility or looking at that CMO. So it's almost like a bridge facility that make you get to the clinic much faster.
Oh, that's great. It just seems like there's not really a much of a downside inherent in this decision to be able to do something like that. So that's really good. Well, hey, Ravi, thank you so much for being on today. I appreciate it. I continue to learn more and more about the industry and all the different products and services that we have out there. And I definitely did today. So thank you for being on today.
Absolutely.
And I hope that you're able to make it all the way through your book, because you got a long ways to go to make it through the entire history of humanity.
Yes. Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jesse. And it was a pleasure speaking with you.
All right. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye now.